Well, because the markets have in fact been becoming much, much more dangerous and much, much less useful for decades now. The markets were developed just before the Renaissance and have no ability to understand the network capacities of the internet. And so one of the basic problems of the existing design is that it's quite possible for a subset of the market to effectively create a conspiracy. And the cool thing is that they don't even have to conspire with each other to make this happen. Just sort of a passion of the crowd can sweep up and sort of create riptides in the system that will cause the markets to suddenly boom or suddenly crash. A very public incidence of this was the Wall Street bets phenomenon, where Reddit and Twitter sort of accidentally created such a thing among large numbers of retail investors that had gotten on through Robinhood. But a much more notorious example of this is the global financial crisis and the credit meltdown that resulted because the banks essentially talked themselves into loaning more money to buy an asset that they then decided was worth more money because they'd loaned more money to buy that asset so that they could loan more money to buy that asset again.
Isn't that the fundamental system of government?
Well, this is the very serious issue. Getting back to our earlier conversation of what computational math does, computers are really, really good at loop behavior, and they will drive loops very quickly. So one of the first things you'll run across if you start programming computers is an infinite loop.
And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. Today we have Noah Healy on the show. We were in this chat a little while ago talking about it. A lot of these things that we're about to chat about. He is a recreational mathematician. Now, most of you are thinking, you know what, I'm going to go out and throw the football out in the field. No, we're going to do some math. And so I'm super excited to have you on the show. Math is one of my passions. When we were chatting about all the things about patents and commodities, I'm like, dude, I got to get you on the show and we got to be chatting. So thank you very much for joining with me.
Well, thanks for having me here, Steve. I'm looking forward to this.
Now, one of the things that when we use the word math, people kind of like, some people yawn, some people get excited. Let's talk about the enthusiasm around math and why people should be excited around math and some of the applications that you kind of put together, using math as a basic fundamental. I mean, obviously we know there's so many things, but I just want to get people excited around the idea, around the technology that can happen or the systems and processes that can happen out of having a really good, strong focus on math and the analytics that come out of it.
Well, I think probably the first and most fundamental thing to understand is that computers are actually the outgrowth of a technique that was developed in order to do mathematical proofs. So if you like video games, if your job depends on the existence of the internet, that exists not as an object of mathematical pursuit, but as a side effect of mathematical pursuit. And because of the relationship of computers to that side effect, these are math machines. And so increasing your comprehension and ability to reason mathematically turns these from just sort of, passive objects in your landscape to tools that you can actually use to achieve things.
And what kind of got you, if you go back to the inception point for people who are in high school or younger listeners, what got you excited about math at the beginning? What was that sort of, this is the direction that I want to go?
For me, I kind of fell into it. I was above average in skill at computation, and computation itself is one of the things that some people get a kick out of. I found after being able to multiply, multi-digit numbers in my head or rapidly on paper with a few more digits, palled rather quickly. But once I got a job working with computers, I learned entirely new kinds of ways for that sort of intricate computation to occur. And so problems like regular expressions, sorts, searches, those sorts of algorithmic improvements reignited that passion.
It's interesting when you say that. When I was, and I love math, but I never was really good at basic math. And I used to do okay at math until we could have a calculator in the class. And then we could have a calculator in the class. We're doing like calculus, we're doing finite math, we're doing algebra. And the calculator was just the tool to take care of the basic fundamentals. Then all of a sudden I started to do accelerated math, and it became the passion of mine.
When I was in high school, I was on the computer science team, and there was this kid who was basically the best in the state. So he'd win first prize. We'd get second prize. And second prize was a scientific calculator. And so I had the scientific calculator. It was pretty sweet. And then over the summer, it got broken. And so the next year I was taking physics. And I was like, well, I'm going to get this pretty sweet scientific calculator in a few months. So I'm not going to go buy another calculator just for physics class. And so I had already taken calculus, and most of the math was fine, but some of it's trigonometry. And if you've taken some calculus, you know that there's some fairly straightforward algebraic approximations of trigonometric identities, assuming you're comfortable with third and fourth order functions, which I am. So I was solving the trigonometric problems algebraically, and that led to large numbers of marks on my paper of these, cubic and quartic functions with 2 or 3 digits of approximation in them. So after a few tests, my teacher sort of pulls me aside and is like, "What's up with this wedding cake, business on the tests?" And I explained that, I don't have a calculator, but I'm going to have a calculator. I don't really want to bother getting one. So he actually said, "Okay, there's a sine and cosine, the trigonometric tables in the back of your book. Just use the trigonometric tables. I know what you're doing." But it wound up somewhat coming in handy, because in college, in physics, we had a physics pop quiz, and once again, I had no calculator, and so I finished the test. I got done. It was supposed to be a 1-hour test. I got done in 20 minutes, and at sort of study hall, the students were getting together after for homework section and review, and they're like, "How did you finish the test that quickly?" And I was like, what do you mean quickly? I was there for 20 minutes. I didn't have my calculator with me. I had to do all these big, cubic approximations to get the signs. And they looked at me like I was an alien.
That's amazing. It's so fun. And now it's interesting, when I was looking at some of the math homework that my son brought back, they're very specific about how you follow the exact way to get to the answer. And I know for me, I would say not like you, because I think you hold a higher focus on math than I did. But I'd find a way to get to things, because sometimes I might have skipped the class or whatever, but I'd get to the right answer. I just might go on a journey to get there that maybe they wouldn't have taught in class. And
that was actually an issue for me. In 7th grade, I was taking an algebra class sort of a grade level ahead. And because I'm very familiar with the properties of numbers, I would generally solve the algebraic example problems by noticing properties of numbers. And you're supposed to just sort of apply these brute force formulas. And the teacher ultimately essentially separated me from the class, because it was too confusing. They were trying to get the basic mechanics down. And starting from then, I started bringing books into school to read for pleasure during school classes, and basically stopped doing homework in exchange for also not participating in class, and just taking tests.
With that, and I had the exact same experience. In fact, my principal said, because I'd skip a lot of classes and I'd get in trouble for that. And then I had a math teacher who said, "Look, as long as you get above 95 on the math test, you can do whatever you want. Just get above 95%. And because I'd be sitting in his class and I'd put my head down on the desk and I'd start sleeping because it just wasn't moving at the pace that I wanted it to. Or I'd just skip the class entirely and go out and play sports or do something that was a little bit more entertaining. And he just said, as long as you hit the targets, I'm cool. Right. But if the second you don't hit the targets, you're in class and you're doing this or else we're going to drop your mark. And that was great for me because then I was finally able to work in the way that I work, not necessarily in the way that the system worked.
Yeah, that's the hard trick for real life, isn't it?
It is, and then if you think about it, because they were able to adapt to the way that you operate, now let's fast forward to where you are today and some of the things that you're working on, because, out of that baseline, you've been able to then start to really focus and hone in on creating systems, models, and invariably patents that you're working on around certain systems and specifically around commodities. So if we first start off for people who don't understand the commodity space, we can kind of just give a landscape of what commodities really look like, and then specifically how they operate today and what you're proposing and how they could operate tomorrow.
Sure. So commodities are pretty basic. They are materials that are of uniform quality. So wheat is wheat, corn is corn, cotton is cotton, that kind of thing. Now, this is achieved in basically two ways. Number one, there have to be grading systems that exist that allow people to meet the marks. But the second part of that is that we then have highly competitive market spaces. So anybody that's ever been in a room with an MBA knows that competition is the enemy. But if you've got like a family farm or anything else, you're competing with basically everybody else to produce things like copper or oil or something like that. And there is a benefit. So the upside of producing commodities is that basically no sales and marketing team. If you've got a dairy farm, you don't have to convince people to buy your milk. You just have to hit the production quality numbers, and then you can just sell as much as you can produce. And so those sorts of arrangements occur through marketplaces. And so we have these markets that we've been using for centuries, and what their existence is predicated on is that when lots and lots of people are doing fairly similar things, then they only need fairly similar deals in order to do those things. And so this creates this very high flow. In this country, I believe the trading flow is somewhere between $5 and $6 trillion a year. And the market overheads on that are in the neighborhood of $1 trillion a year.
When you say market overheads, describe that word.
So if you're talking about farms, which is sort of the most natural one, there's something called the farm gate price. And so that's basically the number of dollars that the farmer actually gets, across his transom. Then there's something that doesn't really have a name, but whoever's actually taking delivery, there's how big the check they have to write is. Every difference between those two numbers is the transaction cost. A tiny part of that is transportation and like warehouse fees usually, although there was a scam that jumped those up in the aluminum market a decade or so ago. But the large amount of it is just middlemen, traders who've managed to work out how to buy risk from both sides. And so they are basically creating a middle between the people that need these products and the people that make these products.
So when we look at the benefits and then we look at the challenges, let's talk a little bit about why should we think that this needs to be changed? Like if it's been running like this for a while, so what? Like why would I want to shift the way that things are doing?
Well, for starters, it's already starting to visibly collapse. Just a few years ago, the beef market had to shut down for several months because it had become so thinly traded that it moved several percent on a single trade. So to put this in context, imagine if the Dow Jones Industrial Average changed by 300 points as a result of the sale of a single share of stock.
Yeah. So
So,
why?
well, because the markets have in fact been becoming much, much more dangerous and much, much less useful for decades now. The markets were developed just before the Renaissance and have no ability to understand the network capacities of the internet. And so one of the basic problems of the existing design is that it's quite possible for a subset of the market to effectively create a conspiracy. And the cool thing is that they don't even have to conspire with each other to make this happen. Just sort of a passion of the crowd can sweep up and sort of create riptides in the system that will cause the markets to suddenly boom or suddenly crash. A very public incidence of this was the Wall Street bets phenomenon, where Reddit and Twitter sort of accidentally created such a thing among large numbers of retail investors that had gotten on through Robinhood. But
Mm-hmm.
a much more notorious example of this is the global financial crisis and the credit meltdown that resulted because the banks essentially talked themselves into loaning more money to buy an asset that they then decided was worth more money because they'd loaned more money to buy that asset so that they could loan more money to buy that asset again.
Isn't that the fundamental
And
system of
created
government?
This is the very serious issue. Getting back to our earlier conversation of what computational math does, computers are really, really good at loop behavior, and they will drive loops very quickly. So one of the first things you'll run across if you start programming computers is an infinite loop. And there's a number of different kinds of ways that you can crash a system through infinite loops. And now that we have these machines that loop infinitely very conveniently, many of our systems have these sorts of errors in them, which wasn't such a big deal when it was people who are kind of, we're slow, we're lazy, eventually we die of old age. There were all these things that kept these loops from being able to happen fast enough and often enough to actually break our systems. And then we plugged computers that had none of those flaws into them. And so now we're seeing our markets, people, reasonably aged human beings alive today have seen the market crash 3-4 times. While market crashes are certainly not unknown in history, if you wanted to do that in, say, 1970, you would have had to have been more than a century old. And if you'd wanted to do that in 1870, you would have had to be more than several centuries old.
So the frequency is what you're saying is happening at a higher rate. Are we saying the peaks and the values are getting, higher and lower?
Well, that's the very visible outcome, but it's actually significantly worse than that. So the entire point of the marketplace is that there actually is a baseline human economic interest. We want to eat some amount of corn and beef. We want to wear some amount of wool and cotton. We want to actually build some amount of bricks and, boards. How much? Well, that's what the market's there for, is to arrange all those things out, let people know how much gas is actually going to cost, and decide what it is they actually want to do under those constraints. And so as that information becomes less and less reliable and more expensive, we wind up going off on boondoggles and investing in things that really don't have any kind of a future. And that's basically the world that we are presently living in, where the markets are telling us that, this company is ridiculously valuable, just because maybe some kids on Twitch who are live streaming themselves day trading decided it, or maybe because Boeing, for example, still has a high stock price in spite of the fact that one of their engines just self-peeled during flight. So the market's connection to actual reality is becoming more and more tenuous, and that's showing up as these sort of spikes and valleys. But the deeper cause is that with our ability to shove machines in, human input is actually being removed from the marketplace. And so once it starts telling us, if you got Stephen King to write what the market says, it might be a lot more engaging, but you wouldn't necessarily want to live there.
Yeah, that's right. No dead pets. It's interesting when you talk about adding the machines, because I know there's some people when they go to markets, they'll say, well, what are the big guys doing? And we'll just follow whatever their trades are. And then if you set up a machine that says programmatically, we're just going to follow what the big guys do. And so that then is again one of those systems and models that's destined to create problems, because now it's not based on fundamentals; it's just based on popularity.
Exactly. Yeah, and that means that we're spending more and more for a product that's worth less and less, and again, that's a bad loop to be in. And we have these machines that do loops very, very quickly. So that's the kind of disaster that we're looking at.
Yeah, in the idea of the machine doing a loop, I mean, we've all written that Excel, one thing that just does a loop and crashes, or wrote a program and it just all of a sudden spirals out of control. Especially when you start throwing large language models and, all this new AI stuff at it, it's going to start going through all of these loops. And we played with enough with AI to know AI works until it doesn't. And then it gets into this really bad loop of making bad decisions. And whether that's in a GPT that you've created or whether that's in some sort of sister model that you put out, what do you think that AI is going to do as it gets thrown into the mire of all of this? I mean, it's already there.
Well, as I've told people in many cases, you have the wrong tense. So actually, BlackRock has been using an AI system called Aladdin for close to 2 decades now. There's another group called Renaissance Technologies, and they're not that forthcoming about what they do, but they've been reliably beating the marketplace for well over a quarter of a century at this point. And what they claim to have been doing is building effectively self-reliant AI models to just go out and trade their own money for them, and that's what they say they've been doing for decades now. So, in the exact time period that I'm talking about, where we've seen markets become less stable and more expensive, we've had AI technology that isn't producing, palindromes and witticisms and stuff, but is actually producing market actionable strategies and executing them. That's exactly what's been happening. So,
to the benefit of the individual, for sure, and the basis of profits, but to the market itself, driving a spiral of demise is what you're saying.
Yeah. People like Larry Fink, and I can't remember the guy's name that runs Renaissance, but he's usually billed as the world's smartest billionaire. He's got a Fields Medal. And they're doing very, very well out of a system that is broken.
So we've sort of painted a bleak landscape, and I have a sign behind me that says no negativity allowed. So I have to subscribe to the sign that I have. How do we fix this? Like, what is the way to get out of the problem that we're in?
Well, I call them coordinated discovery markets. And speaking of generative AI, you can actually ask ChatGPT what a coordinated discovery market is, or Claude, or any of the rest of them, because I've been doing this for long enough that they'll explain what I'm explaining. But the marketplace, if we break it down again, what the marketplace is about is finding consensus information and communicating consensus information. And the problem with that is basically noise. Everybody's got an opinion, people's opinions are partially right. Some people's opinions are more partially right than others. But how do we sort of gather up all the actual human interests and carve out a path of where prices actually are and where they're actually going? And so that's what I did. I found a way to change the structure of the market from a two-player buyer-seller game to a three-player producer-consumer negotiator game. And by setting it up that way, right now the market works in tension where both sides are essentially in a tug of war. And the idea is that since both sides are going to be roughly equally strong, that the center of that rope is going to wind up about where it's supposed to be. Computers broke that balance, and basically, there's like a world strongman or like a heavyweight lifting champion out on the playground with the kids now, and he just rips people off their feet into the mud, and then he goes over and gets another kid and rips them off the feet into the mud too. So what I've done is created this three-player game where effectively everybody's against the world. So when the market goes wrong, everybody loses money. And when the market goes right, everybody makes money.
So I want to play that. That's a very interesting way of looking at the supply and demand curve, because that's one thing I've never really thought about is you think about the buyer and the seller, and the buyer and the seller, by virtue of a large group of buyers and a large group of sellers, that invariably you make this connection point of what the true value of whatever something is. What something's worth, what somebody's willing to pay. But what you're saying is that doesn't take into context the skill or the strength of the buyer, or the skill or the strength of the seller. And if it's disproportionately put in the hands of one group, then that whole supply and demand curve kind of goes to pot. Is that what you're saying?
Effectively. So if you think about sort of the classic, supply demand curve, you basically got an X, right? And we always are taught it and think about it in terms of that crossing point, but we never actually get to that crossing point. We have middlemen, we've got traders, we've got experienced people. And so what happens is you're sort of climbing up that hill towards that crossing point. And at some point below that crossing point, you hit your culture's efficiency level. And what happens is you get the buyers sort of get up to as high as they can get, and there's a little plateau up there. And that's where the traders run back and forth across that plateau. And what computers basically did is let them dynamite the plateau down and widen out those buyers and sellers. And so the reason why we've been able to up like land productivity by a factor of 10. And that's not just in agriculture. We have new chemical techniques that allow people to go back to tailings from previous mines and remine the tailings, because there's just so much crap that's still in there that we can pull out with our now stronger acids and things like that. We've become radically more productive at the same time that the people doing that production have lowered their profit margins. So how does, you get 10 times better at your work. Now you're on welfare. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, exactly.
It works because the middlemen didn't get 10 times better. They got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times better. Computers are getting 1,000 times more powerful, every 15 years. And that productivity is being focused and concentrated in the command, control, and intelligence portions of our society. And so they're basically sucking up a larger and larger portion. But just, live by the sword, die by the sword, live by the algorithm, die by the algorithm. We can reconceive these systems algorithmically to make production valuable again. And then we'll become, we already have the tools to be productive. We can just create the incentives to get people to apply that.
So I kind of see what you're saying. So when we look at the supply and demand curve, we always talk about that X, but it's really not about the X. It's about the tails on the end of those X's, or where the supplier.
Right. It's about how close to that X you can actually get. Because
I see.
There's two different interests, right? The closer you get to that X, the richer your society gets. But the further you get away from that X, the more the middlemen make.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so now, does your society have a way to create a tension with middlemen? Well, look at our society. It doesn't really look like we have one of those. But again,
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at
information,
any
yeah,
of the other, even if we look at other industries outside of commodities, and we see the middlemen are sort of dominating the markets. The administrator class. The administrator class comes into us like when you look at construction, you've got all of these different administrator class organizations that they call themselves governing bodies for the perspective of the benefit of the construction person. But invariably, they just start getting fat and they just start making a lot of money off of the construction company. And invariably, they're making less and less as the producer. So that administrator class comes in, just like you talk about the middleman comes in and starts eating away at all the value that's being created by the producing class. So is that sort of summary what you're saying?
That's absolutely what we've seen multiplied across every different industry. Uber has no intention to ever make cars or build taxi companies. Their long-term plan is for other people to solve the problem of self-guided vehicles and for them to become the sole portal to transportation on planet Earth, which is insane and evil, frankly.
Oh, I mean, anybody who comes over and dominates a whole space, you got to wonder the ethics around that. And I mean, domination is great. I mean, if I were the world champion of boxing, I mean, I'm not going to feel bad about it. I'm going to feel good about that. So, I mean, there's a certain amount of competition. Healthy competition is good. I think the word unhealthy competition, I think there's a problem with that.
Well,
as well as unhealthy administration.
Yes, there's a very real difference between winner-take-all competitions and sort of evolutionary competitions where there's sort of a bar and you break the bar and everything's cool, and you're below the bar and everything's not cool. Our society has become very, very focused on winner-take-all competitions, which for like boxing is pretty valuable. It would sort of suck if there were thousands and thousands of people who beat people up for a living and we're really, really good at it. Like that we're way better off in a world where we keep that kind of situation very focused, and sure, we make a few millionaires, but who cares? That's a rounding error. But turning everything into a winner-take-all competition, it might be nice to have the single best taxi driver in human history, and I think I might have had him in Beijing once, but people need jobs, and if it's impossible to be employed unless you're Michael Jordan, then nobody's going to be employed anymore.
Well, that's obviously the biggest fear as we go forward, but that's a whole nother conversation. I'd love to have you chat with you on that one. But to focus a little bit more on, you talked about there's the buyer, the seller, and then there's the negotiator. How do we turn the word negotiator not into the administrator? And you said the buyer and seller, instead of against each other.
Right. Yeah. So there's actually an operator, and they're the administrator. And in my case, the operator is a computer system that's completely open source that works by simply auditing the entire system of what everybody's doing. And because of the way it's designed, they effectively can make all decisions arbitrarily. So you need a human being to legally hold the bag, but the computer actually does the actual work, and the computer does the work by not caring at all. So all the sort of cronyism and corruption that's implicit in ordinary administration goes bye-bye, because the human being that's holding the bag for the computer program is basically on the hook for not being a crony and not interfering with the verifiable computer program. So anybody that wants to check whether or not he's doing what he's supposed to do can simply read the inputs that are coming in and the code, which is all public information, and reproduce and see that they came up with the same answer he's coming up with.
So because the code is public, it means that it doesn't have that inherent flaw of having a private code or a government regulated code where it becomes more of an instrument of control rather than an instrument of exchange.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a pretty serious flaw in our modern security thinking. In a human administration system, privacy is extremely important because you don't want undue pressure brought on the regulators, but that, of course, has its own problem with corruption of the administration and regulation. But for computers, it's the exact opposite of that. Because they're machines, we need to be able to examine them to determine whether or not they're designed and operating properly.
Yeah, whether or not they have a predisposition to some sort of behavior pattern that, inadvertently or inadvertently benefits a specific receiver.
Absolutely.
So if the code's public, and again, I'm not a tech professional, does that make it more safe, or does that make it more apt to having hackers and that sort of thing when people know the code?
Much more safe. So 2 quick tales of recent history. There was an attempt to upload, which actually got into a sort of alpha version of the Linux code base, something known as a privilege escalation. So basically, some people went in, joined the open source community, wrote a hole in the back end of the system, submitted the hole, and got it accepted. But before it actually got to anywhere where it would be published, it was detected that this was happening, and it got canceled out, and it's not going to happen. A little bit before then, it was discovered rather accidentally, or published rather accidentally, that Apple had actually acceded to a hardware backend being placed into their products by the U.S. government. That hardware backend has no possibility of a software fix. It's just a permanent open problem that every Apple device, at least in the last several decades, has and will continue to have forever. And whoever in the government has the keys, plus anyone else who has access to those keys by whatever mechanism, can use that backdoor into Apple products. And it's not terribly unlikely that similar backdoors exist in other closed form products as well.
Interesting. So what you're saying is where people perceive Apple as having a very strong gate, there's a built into the DNA of the hardware backdoor that a government has the access to key into.
That story came out about a month ago.
Wow. Does it, and the same thing exists on the Microsoft side as well, or?
So Microsoft is somewhat more hardware agnostic. I would judge it unlikely that the U.S. government had not leaned on Microsoft for a software perspective at some point. Microsoft was instrumental in something called the Trusted Computing Program, which is at the very least on all laptops, and which, unless you disable it, which you can't do with Microsoft products, your laptop has not, strictly speaking, a backdoor, but a privilege mode that you, as the owner of the machine, have no access to, but media companies have access to, so that they can detect whether or not you're attempting to use your machine to do things with their content that they would deem undesirable, like do anything other than looking at it.
Interesting. So then how do you avoid all of that if you wanted to have ultimate privacy, or is that something that just doesn't exist in today's world?
Well, if you own a home, you could install a Faraday cage and sleep inside of it.
So we got to get our metal hats on, and
Part of our fundamental problem in this day and age is to establish a form of society that works with the technology that we have. One point that I like to make to people who feel that this privacy invasion is way too much and way too far, which I totally agree with, is that most of the human beings that have lived in the historical period lived in villages where the average degree of privacy experienced by an individual was even lower than somebody that's currently being scoped out by the FBI, the NSA, Google, and Facebook. If you're living in a village with a few hundred people, not only does everybody know where you are and what you're doing all day, every day, but they know, everything else about you too. And so
That's true. Yeah.
so it's not impossible for human beings to have some sort of living accommodation that functions with some of these sorts of what would appear to be impositions. But our society isn't currently built around the assumption of that existing. And so some of the things that we've seen with the radical increase in mental illness among teenagers and young people, and the financial difficulties for most of the citizens in developed countries, leading to demographic collapse. These things are all symptoms of the fact that the societies that we've built were built by people who, basically were just inventing cars and had railroads and stuff like that. And we have much, much more powerful machines that are completely ubiquitous. And we're going to need much, much more powerful societies that can wield that power in ways that are helpful to the society, not simply helpful to the people who happen to be on top of the present societies.
Yeah, and I think that goes down to the idea that, fire makes a really good slave. It makes a terrible master. And I think when we look at technology sits in that same caliber. Right now, many people would perceive technology as nearing master because of just the pervasive nature that it has within society. The fact that most people, if all the computers shut down, would not be able to function. They can't grow their own food. They can't connect to their ecosystem of the people that they know. They're going to remain disconnected and try to figure out how they can solve life moving forward. And so really technology has taken that master role inadvertently or by design.
I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I think that to some extent that is a point of view being promulgated by the people who are actually in charge. So I see people as still having the master role, and I think that much as kings and queens didn't have much of a future once the model of combat shifted from knights on horseback to tanks, I think that CEOs and presidents won't have much of a role in a functioning society when the process of communicating across continental distances and coordinating meetups among hundreds of people is once again goes from having some guy who's tall and shouts loud versus the ability to create viral content.
And a lot of people will say that the democratization of communication through things like social media and the fact that, Joe down the street could have as much clout as, somebody who is being propagated by, public media. As much as that is somewhat true, the baseline system, the operating system that's propagating those messages still has a master, and that master would be that CEO of that company. And so therefore they're still the one who's in control of the domain of play.
I would view that as a temporary circumstance at best.
Interesting. Tell me more on that.
Well, we're already seeing the job of being CEO becoming more and more difficult, and the technology that we're developing around AI is actually ideally suited to replacing the jobs at the top of our society. Now, for social and cultural reasons, we are focusing our efforts on replacing bottom of our society jobs. But if you build an AI robot that can be a garbage man or drive a truck, then it will have already had the capacity to run a Fortune 500 company better than the current management can.
And that is so here's the question. When do you think the first AI CEO will come out?
Well, I would like a model something like mine to be that thing. So my system is not an AI in the in the sense that it's generally being pushed out. My system is a super intelligence alignment algorithm. So it's essentially a mechanism where human and artificial intelligences can join together to create better decision making. So that'd be fantastic. But if it doesn't go that way, I'd guess that some of these more troubled companies, companies like Boeing and Disney, and think about sort of old school blue chips that are very publicly failing. Budweiser, as it becomes more and more obvious that these institutions are incompetent or criminal or both, pressures will mount to get rid of people, and eventually there won't be people to replace those people. Like, who's gonna sign up to defend something that's completely publicly discredited?
So if you said, for example, and let's just look at Disney for a moment and say you're going to take the board of directors and replace them with AI, or take the CEO and replace them with AI, or bring in an AI third-party consultant to help them re-landscape the organization based on some fundamentals. It just goes down to who's writing those fundamentals of what the new business model needs to work like. And is that being written through AI? Is that being written by an individual?
Well, so that's actually a general, this is another one of my old aphorisms. If your company buys software, then every decision made about how your company runs by the people that wrote that software is how your company runs. And that's true for your spreadsheet software, or if you got an AI executive coach in somehow. That's just a basic fact that most people do not seem to be aware of. In general, I would expect the form of the job to change unrecognizably. So the example I generally use is that modern tractors don't actually work the same way that, say, 17th century plows work, because when you have access to the amount of power that a diesel engine gives you, it no longer makes sense to design your plowshare in the same way. You can get better kinds of outcomes by doing this more powerful thing. And so the existing executive roles are in many cases predicated on the human limitations that are intrinsic. And so I would say that an AI-ifying organization would re-architect itself around the concept of information, and the dividing line of information would be signal and noise. And so they would need to sit down and essentially make decisions about what the dividing line of signal and noise was for their organization, and create routed feedbacks from those things to whatever was actually going on in their system. And so there, something like Netflix, which had a handful of analytics-based home runs before they just started deciding to throw money at everybody, because their business model said that they could, they didn't actually have to account for their failures anymore. But that sort of re-architecting and reorganizing around information instead of individuals is the sort of thing that happens and then allows you to exploit what computers are good at, which is remembering things very clearly and rapidly, and again, doing, very tight loops very quickly. And so microtransactions, very, very small things that you can add up a whole bunch of, and humans would still be involved, but the sorts of executive power that presently exists would be distributed across an organization that was more complicated, because it had access to computer processing of the inputs and outputs of that organization.
So if we step that up a notch and look at governments rather than corporations, and you look at the voted in parties that come in and they all make decisions based on constituencies and or whatever party tells them to do, if they're party solidarity. But the idea is, could this same model then propagate into how governments run?
Absolutely.
And
I would expect governments run on our lines just as governments that were run on previous age lines. There aren't a lot of divine right kings operating on Earth today. There are a few, and the ones that exist endorsed by their own fiat, basically the Bill of Rights of the United States of America, because it turns out that that's more or less the legal environment that human beings living in industrial society need to be able to thrive economically and personally. But we don't know what the legal environment required of people to thrive in a computational environment. There's only a few dozen thrivers right now, and they're not generalizable. Everybody can't be Jeff Bezos. So that's the hard process that's in front of us is working out what sort of modus vivendi actually would exist. One interesting idea is that juries are significantly easier to pull together in an environment where lots of people are online and secure communications links exist. And so we could actually see vastly greater jurification of decision making and less requirement for representation as a consequence.
Yeah. Now, again, it goes down to the people who show up for jury are, a different body than the people who don't. And I'm not saying I'm not an American, so I don't know the jury process down in the States of how that works. But, for me, I would look and say I'd prefer not to be on a jury where possible because I have other objectives to achieve in my life. But are you saying these are people who they're being chosen to be on this jury by random selection, or are these people who are choosing to be on the jury? And how would that be anything different than somebody who's just choosing to be a politician?
Well, again, this is the challenge. We have no actual examples of working societies that have computers. We have societies that have computers, and those societies have terrible reproduction rates, massive, unemployment problems, serious mental health issues, declining life expectancies. So those don't work. We have other societies that are growing, but they live in the Stone Age. Maybe that's as good as we can do as human beings. I don't think that's the case, but nobody knows. So the problem is to actually work through the problem, which is how do we make societies that are made out of people that are economically productive, mentally and physically healthy, and also, biologically procreative, so that there's still a society and a generation. And we very obviously don't have a solution to that problem. What I have is a suggestion for how to produce an economic baseline.
So it's actually interesting because then what you're saying is, and hopefully I'm getting this right, what you're saying is, or alluding to, is that it's not a left problem. It's not a right problem. It's potentially not even an economic problem or a social problem. The one thing that we have not been able to reconcile in the past 30 years is a technology problem and the impact of what that's doing to our society.
I would actually argue that it's even deeper than that. It's actually a math problem. So what Alan Turing did when he incidentally invented the computer so he could prove something he was really interested in was he disproved the fundamental assumption of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment politically built out on the assumption that it would be possible to base your society in reason, because reason had all of the properties that God had offered the divine right monarchies. It was this external, eternal, true thing. And what Alan Turing did was demonstrate that it wasn't omnipotent and that its entire content, well, some other people had to point this out eventually, but they did within a few decades, its entire content was simply whatever its premises happened to be. And so the justification for the kinds of governments we have and the kind of economy we have was disproved at the same time that the computer was invented. And then we confirmed that computers really worked by building them and filling the world up with them and, using them for doing everything. But they are inimical to democratic systems, markets, normal culture, having conversations with people at an absolutely fundamental level. If computers exist, then voting doesn't make any sense. This is, and there's a guy named Kenneth Arrow that got the Nobel Prize in 1970 for proving that voting doesn't make any sense and cannot be made to make sense.
That is so interesting and well timed for the the year that we're sitting in right now. And it's also great to bring the podcast right back. My podcasts are usually a lot shorter, but the thing is, Ben, we were just chatting and I could talk. We haven't even hit patents yet. And so it's been great to start off with talking about the importance of math and the importance of supporting the different ways that people learn math, because then you can turn into somebody like yourself, Noah, who's got so much knowledge and has really dedicated your life to the craft of math through the different applications of it, and to just close off right at the very end and say that really at the heart of it is math.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of big outgrowth of the 20th century. The computational math is the mathematics of imagination. And so everything you imagine is actually a mathematical proof.
I love it. So thank you so much, Noah, for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And as I said to you before, I could talk to you for hours, and, today proves it. And I definitely want to have you back on the show to talk about patents, because that was one of the things that we definitely wanted to hit. So I'd love to have you back. And thank you so much for being here, my man.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm happy to come back and get on to topic.
That's right. And anybody who wants to reach out to him, it's Noah Healy. He's on LinkedIn, easy to find. He's got the bomb, BOMBE, behind his picture with him with the red shirt. So it's easy to locate him and have a great conversation. Have him on your podcast because he's just got so much to talk about. Man, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being here. And with that, guys, this is the money. This is the mindset. This is the mentoring podcast. We will see you on the next one.